The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late April, and Marlene Voss set it on the kitchen windowsill without opening it. She did that sometimes. Let things sit. Let them breathe in the morning light before she decided what they were going to mean to her. The envelope was from the Harlan County Agricultural Extension Office, and she already knew what was inside, the third drought advisory of the season, the one that would tell her, in careful bureaucratic language, what Dale Pruitt at the co-op had already told her in plain terms the week before. That she ought to consider reducing her flock. That the Flint Hills of southeastern Kansas were entering what the meteorologists were calling a multi-year precipitation deficit. That a woman running 112 head of Katahdin hair sheep on 240 acres of shortgrass pasture, without a husband and without a partner and without so much as a hired hand past October, might want to think seriously about her options. Marlene poured her coffee and looked out the window at the pasture, where the morning was still cool enough to be kind. The ewes were grazing in loose clusters near the eastern fence line, their warm-colored backs moving slow and easy through the pale grass. Katahdin sheep don't grow wool, they shed their winter coats the way deer do, in rough patches and long handfuls, and on mornings like this, when the light came in at that low April angle, they looked like something the land had always intended to put there. Marlene had thought that since the first day she brought them home, 12 years ago, in a borrowed stock trailer with a broken tailgate latch and $40 in her pocket after the down payment. She drank her coffee. She left the letter on the windowsill. But here is what the letter did not know, and what Dale Pruitt did not know, and what the 3 county extension agents who would eventually drive out to her property that summer would not know until they stood on her ground and saw it with their own eyes. Marlene Voss had been preparing for this drought for 6 years. 6 years of reading. Of ordering publications from the Noble Research Institute in Ardmore, Oklahoma, and the Savory Institute out of Colorado, and a small land trust in West Texas that nobody in Harlan County had ever heard of. 6 years of soil samples and rotational grazing maps drawn in pencil on graph paper and tacked above her kitchen table. 6 years of watching her neighbors plow and fertilize and spray, and saying nothing, and doing differently. The Katahdin sheep, it would turn out, were only part of it. But that is getting ahead of things. Marlene Voss was 53 years old in the spring of 2019. She had been farming this land since she was 41, when her mother died and left her the 240 acres and a note on the kitchen table that said, in her mother's particular handwriting, "Marlene, don't sell it. The land knows you." Her mother, Ruth Voss, had kept a few beef cattle on the property and a kitchen garden and not much else. The farm had never been profitable in any serious sense. It had been a thing Ruth held onto the way certain people hold on to difficult truths, because letting go felt like a worse kind of loss. Marlene had grown up on that land, left it at 18 for a nursing degree in Wichita, worked 20 years in the cardiac unit at Wesley Medical Center, and come back at 41 to find the pastures overgrazed and the soil cracked and the fences strung with rust. She took early retirement. She cashed out a modest 401k. And she started over. The neighbors thought she was having some kind of breakdown. Carol Bremer, who farmed the adjoining 400 acres with her son Travis, brought over a casserole in September of that first year and asked, in a voice full of gentle concern, whether Marlene had considered something simpler. A few chickens, maybe. A little vegetable operation. Something manageable for a woman on her own. Marlene thanked her for the casserole. She ordered her first 40 ewes from a registered Katahdin breeder in Kentucky that same week. The choice of Katahdins was not accidental and never had been. Marlene had spent 4 months researching breeds before she committed. She had read everything she could find about heat tolerance and parasite resistance and forage efficiency. She had called 3 breeders and 2 university extension specialists, not in Kansas, because the Kansas specialists kept recommending commercial Rambouillet crosses, but one in Tennessee and one at Langston University in Oklahoma, who both told her the same thing in different words, that Katahdin hair sheep, developed in Maine in the 1950s by a man named Michael Peel who crossed African hair sheep with British breeds, had been slowly, quietly becoming the most resilient meat sheep in the American South and Midwest. That their parasite resistance alone could cut a small farmer's veterinary costs in half. That they were calm, hardy, easy to lamb, and that they did not require shearing, which for a woman working alone was not a small thing. She also liked that they were not fashionable. Nobody in Harlan County was running Katahdins. Nobody would be trying to give her advice she hadn't asked for. The first 3 years were hard, and the way's first years on a farm are always hard. She lost 2 ewes to a dog attack the first winter, 1 ram to a respiratory infection she caught too late, and a half-dozen lambs to a late April cold snap that came down out of Colorado like a hand slamming a door. She learned. She adjusted. She built a low-roofed lambing shelter out of reclaimed lumber from the old dairy barn and insulated it with straw bales, and learned to read the sky in February the way her mother had never bothered to. By her 4th year, she was turning a modest profit on lamb sales. By her 6th year, she had built the flock to 112 head and started selling breeding stock to other small farms in the region. A woman in Woodson County. A retired schoolteacher outside of Eureka. A young couple in Coffee County who'd read about her in a 3-paragraph item in the Kansas Farmer magazine and driven 2 hours to see the operation for themselves. None of that impressed Dale Pruitt. Dale had been running the Harlan County Farm Supply and Feed Co-op since his father retired in 2001, and he spoke to women farmers the way some men speak to children who are very earnest about a subject they do not fully understand. He was not cruel about it. He was something worse than cruel, he was patient. He would listen to what Marlene was planning and then nod slowly and say things like, "Well, that's one approach, and I've seen folks try that over in Greenwood County," and let the silence after his words do the work that his words would not. In March of 2019, when Marlene came into the co-op asking about cover crop options for her paddock rotation, she'd been experimenting with a summer cover of sun hemp and cowpeas to shade the soil and fix nitrogen between grazing cycles. Dale listened to her for about 45 seconds before he interrupted. "Marlene." He set his hands on the counter. "The forecast showing less than 6 inches of precip May through September. You understand what that means for the Flint Hills?" She understood. "You're looking at 112 head on ground that maybe supports 60 in a good year. Your cover crops aren't going to germinate in cracked clay. I'm not trying to be the bearer of bad news, but you might want to think about selling down before July. Get ahead of the market instead of chasing it." Marlene bought 40 pounds of sun hemp seed and left. What Dale did not know, what she had never found a reason to explain to him, was that the ground she was grazing was not the same ground it had been 6 years ago. The soil on her 240 acres in the spring of 2019 had a water-holding capacity almost double what it had when she took over. She had soil tests going back 5 years to prove it. Her organic matter percentage, which had been at 1.2% when she first tested in 2014, was now at 3.1. In the Flint Hills clay loam, every 1% increase in organic matter allowed the soil to hold roughly 20,000 additional gallons of water per acre. She had done the math. She had done the math 100 times, on winter evenings at the kitchen table with the graph paper and a pencil and a stack of Noble Research Institute publications, and she had understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who has traced a thing back to its source, that the drought everyone was afraid of was primarily a soil problem. And that she had been solving that soil problem, slowly and without announcement, for 6 years. The sun hemp went in the second week of May, when the soil was still holding just enough moisture from a 1/4 inch of rain in late April. May was dry. June was dry in a way that had weight to it, a thickness in the afternoon air that was less like weather and more like a decision the sky had made. The grass on Carol Bremer's 400 acres to the west went brown by the middle of June. Travis Bremer started hauling in hay by the second week, paying emergency prices from a broker out of Nebraska. 3 farms on the far side of the county sold off livestock in June alone, not because they wanted to, but because the math of feeding animals on bought-in feed against the low price of feeder lambs and stockers made no other sense. Marlene moved her flock. That is the simple way to say it. The true way is more complicated. She had divided her 240 acres into 9 paddocks, sized and shaped over years of observation and adjustment. Some were barely 8 acres. One was nearly 40. She moved the sheep through the paddocks on a rotation she had been refining since 2015, always leaving a paddock to rest for a minimum of 45 days, longer in dry periods, shorter after good rain. The rotation was not a schedule, it was a reading. She read the grass the way she had once read cardiac monitors, watching for the small signs before the large ones. She was looking at root depth, not leaf height. She was watching the soil surface, the presence of insects, the way water moved or did not move after the rare brief storm. The sun hemp in the resting paddocks grew slowly in the June heat, but it grew, because its taproot was drilling down into subsoil moisture that the grass roots never reached. When the sheep eventually came through, they would find standing forage where other farms had dust. July came down hard. On the 4th of July, the temperature at the Chanute weather station, 40 miles north, hit 107 degrees. Marlene was up at 4:30, moving the flock to a paddock with a north-facing slope and 2 large hedge apple trees that threw shade in the afternoon. She had positioned that paddock deliberately 3 years ago, planting the trees herself from whips she bought at the State Conservation District's annual sale for 15 cents each. The trees were 12 feet tall now. Not majestic. Functional. She set out extra mineral tubs and checked the float valves on all 4 of her water tanks before 7 in the morning. Then she went inside, drank a glass of water, and sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes with her eyes closed, listening to the house settle around her in the heat. Her daughter Elena called that afternoon. Elena lived in Lawrence, taught landscape architecture at the university, and worried about her mother with a specific and tender persistence that Marlene found both touching and slightly exhausting. "Mom. It's 105 degrees in Harlan County. I'm looking at it right now on my phone. 107 by Chanute. Mom. The sheep are in the north paddock. They've got water and shade and the humidity's low. They're fine, Elena." A pause. In that pause, the particular texture of Elena's worry. "Travis Bremer called his cousin in Wichita and his cousin called me," Elena said. "He says you're going to lose half your flock by August." Marlene looked at the window. The letter from the extension office was still on the windowsill, where she had left it in April. She'd read it eventually. She'd read it the way she read all such letters, for the data and nothing else, ignoring the parts that told her what to feel about the data. "Travis Bremer," she said, "runs continuous grazing on ground that was already depleted before his father let him take it over." She did not say this with heat. She said it the way she said most things, measured, factual, a little quiet. "Tell him I said thank you for his concern." She hung up and went out to check the water tanks again. What she did not tell Elena was that she was worried about one specific thing, and it had nothing to do with the heat. It had to do with a ewe she'd been watching for 2 weeks, a 4-year-old she called Birch because of the pale splotching on her hindquarters. Birch was one of her best mothers, 3 sets of twins in 3 years, easy labors, attentive to her lambs, but she'd been losing condition faster than the rest of the flock since early June. Hanging back at feeding time. Moving slowly. Marlene had taken a fecal egg count on Birch in late June and found a barber pole worm load higher than she wanted to see. Haemonchus contortus, the parasite that killed more sheep in hot, humid summers than anything else, the one that made veterinarians shake their heads at flocks of wool breeds that had no resistance to it. The reason she had chosen Katahdins in the first place was their Famotchescored resistance to internal parasites. But resistance was relative, and in a drought year, when nutrition was stressed and the immune system worked harder, even resistant animals could have trouble. She was not treating the whole flock. That was the old way, the way that created refugia problems and resistant worm populations. She was treating Birch specifically, and 2 other ewes she'd flagged, with a targeted selective approach she'd read about in a publication from the American Consortium for Small Ruminant Parasite Control. She scored every animal's Famotcha eye color every 3 weeks, the pinkness of the inner eyelid as a proxy for anemia, and treated only those animals that needed it. Dale Pruitt, if he had known this, would have called it overcomplicated. Would have said something about how his grandfather had just drenched the whole flock twice a year and never had problems. Marlene thought about that sometimes. About how confidence and knowledge were not the same thing, and how the distance between them was where the losses happened. Birch responded to treatment. By the third week of July, she was moving with the flock again, eating well, holding her weight. The drought did not ease. If anything, August was harder. The county officially recorded its driest June through August period since 1936. The wheat stubble on the Bremer place burned to a white-gray color that Marlene had never seen on green land before. The pond at the eastern edge of her property dropped 3 feet below its normal summer level, exposing a pale ring of dry mud around the waterline that widened by inches each morning. She watched the pond with a particular attention. That pond was the reason she had installed the overflow-fed tank system 6 years ago, when she first understood what the farm's water infrastructure could and could not sustain. She had buried a 4-inch PVC line from the pond's overflow pipe to a gravity-fed tank in the central paddock, and from that tank to 3 satellite tanks across the property, each with a float valve. In a drought year, with the pond level dropping, the overflow system was not producing. She was running on the stored capacity of the tanks and the secondary well she'd had drilled in 2016, the well that her neighbor Ed Fogarty, who ran a cow-calf operation on the north side of the county road, had called an unnecessary expense when she mentioned it at a township meeting. Ed Fogarty was hauling water in August of 2019. He drove past her place twice a week in his old green Kenworth with the water tank on the flatbed, and Marlene would sometimes be out at the fence line when he passed, checking wire, and they would nod to each other. Ed was a decent man. He did not have Dale Pruitt's particular brand of patient condescension. He was simply working with what he had, which was a farm built for average years, and 2019 was not an average year. In the second week of August, something happened that Marlene had not predicted. She was out in the far west paddock in the early morning, doing her regular flock check, moving quietly among the sheep the way she always did, letting them know her presence before she let herself into the middle of the group, because a Katahdin that trusts its handler is easier to examine than one that doesn't, and trust is built in the quiet accumulations of unhurried mornings. She was checking a young ewe, a first-year animal she'd marked for observation, when she heard a truck on the road. It stopped. She straightened and looked. 2 vehicles, a county extension truck and a silver sedan she didn't recognize. 3 men got out, the county agent, whose name was Brian Luer and who Marlene had met twice before at soil health workshops, and 2 men she did not know who carried clipboards and wore the particular expression of people conducting an official assessment. She walked to the fence. Brian Luer raised a hand. "Morning, Marlene. Sorry to drop by without calling. These are colleagues of mine from the state office, Dr. Patterson and Mr. Graves. They've been visiting farms across the southeast quarter of the state, documenting drought conditions. We had your property on the list." Dr. Patterson, a heavy-set man with wire glasses and a clipboard already open, looked out across the pasture. He looked at it for a moment longer than people usually look at things. Then he said, "How many head are you running?" 112. He wrote something on his clipboard. "And what's your forage situation?" "I've got standing forage in 4 paddocks. 2 of those have sun hemp and cowpea cover mixed in. The other 5 paddocks are in rest, the grass is dormant but alive. Root systems are intact." He looked at her. "How?" Mr. Graves had a flat Midwestern voice and the look of someone who had seen a great deal of cracked pasture in the past 2 months. Marlene considered the question. She had been answering versions of it her whole farming life, and the answer was always the same: it required more words than people expected. Rotational grazing, starting 2014. Rest periods of 45 to 90 days depending on season. No bare soil exposure since 2016. Cover crops on half the rotation since 2017. Soil organic matter went from 1.2% to 3.1% over 5 years. The top 18 inches of my soil holds approximately 2.5 times the water per acre it held when I started. Dr. Patterson had stopped writing. He was just looking at her. "Can we walk it?" he asked. They walked it. All three of them, following Marlene through the paddock gates as she moved the sheep ahead of them with quiet hand signals and a low sound she made in her throat that the flock knew to mean, "Move easy, move now." The three men from the extension office moved through the pasture without speaking for a long time. Mr. Graves crouched at one point and pushed his fingers into the soil near a clump of Sidiotes grama grass. He pushed them into the second knuckle. "That's moisture," he said. "About 4 inches down, yes." He looked up at her. "We've been on farms this week where the soil is powdered dust at 6 inches. Marlene said nothing. She watched the flock moving ahead of them through the amber-colored grass, their backs reddish-brown in the August light, easy and unhurried, the way animals are when they have enough of what they need. Brian Luer had been quietly walking the fence line. He came back and fell into step beside Marlene. "I owe you an apology," he said. He said it simply, without theater, the way honest men admit honest things. "I was in this office in 2015 when you came in asking about soil carbon sequestration protocols. I remember thinking, and I'm not proud of this, I remember thinking you were going down a very long road for very uncertain results." Marlene looked at him. "I was wrong," he said. She nodded. She accepted it the way she accepted most things, without ceremony, without cruelty, without letting anyone see what it cost her to have been right alone for 6 years. They stayed 2 hours. They took soil samples. Dr. Patterson photographed the sun hemp paddocks. They asked detailed questions about the rotational schedule, the tank system, the cover crop seed sources, the FAMACHA scoring protocol, the secondary well. Marlene answered everything without simplifying and without self-congratulation. When they left, she stood at the fence and watched the dust from their tires settle back onto the road. Then she went in and opened the letter from the extension office. It said what she'd known it would say. Reduce flock numbers. Seek financial assistance. Consider emergency hay purchases. She set it back on the windowsill. She made a cup of coffee and stood at the window and looked at her sheep in the late afternoon light. She thought about Ruth Voss. Her mother, who had held this land through her own hard years with a kind of stubborn, wordless love. Who had kept the fence and the pond and the hay barn intact against the slow erosion of small resources and advancing age, and left it all to her daughter with a note that said only, "The land knows you." Marlene had spent 12 years trying to understand what that meant. She thought, standing there with the coffee growing cold in her hand, that she was closer now than she'd ever been. The land does not know you the way a person knows you. Marlene had come to believe that. The land knows you the way a long drought knows the root, by testing. By taking away everything that is surface and seeing what remains underneath. Her mother had survived the land's tests by holding on. Marlene had survived them by paying attention. There was a difference. She was not sure her mother would have seen it as a difference, but she did. Late August is when she started to understand the full shape of what she had done. The county livestock market in Yates Center ran a special sale on the 23rd of August, a drought liquidation sale, the kind that happens when enough farmers in a region are forced to sell at once. Prices dropped. Feeder lambs that had been moving at $1.90 a pound live weight in June were bringing $1.30 by August. 112 head of Katahdins, sold in late August 2019, would have returned roughly 60% of what the same animals would have sold for in June. Several of her neighbors took those losses because they had no choice. Marlene did not sell. She had the forage. She had the water. She had the soil that held both. She was the only producer in Harlan County who was not selling into a broken market. She did, however, sell 12 registered breeding ewes in the last week of August, to a buyer in Missouri who had been on her waiting list since March. Registered Katahdin ewes from a low-input, proven drought year operation. She did not reduce her price. The Missouri buyer did not ask her to. Those 12 ewes sold for a total of $9,840. She put the check in the account she kept separate from operating expenses, the one she'd been building for 4 years, the one Elena only half believed existed. Then she sat at the kitchen table and pulled out the graph paper and the pencil and began updating her fall rotation plan. The fall came in cool and, eventually, wet. Rain in September, not enough to end the drought officially, but enough to wake the dormant grass. On her resting paddocks, where the root systems had stayed alive all summer through the soil biology she'd spent 6 years building, the grass greened up fast. Within 3 weeks of the September rains, paddocks that had looked dead in August were showing 4 inches of new growth. On the Bremer Place and on Ed Fogarty's North Pastures, where continuous grazing had cropped the grass to bare dirt all summer, the regrowth was thin and uneven. They would be behind on forage recovery by at least 2 months. Some of those paddocks would not fully recover until the following spring. Marlene moved her flock back onto the September green paddocks and watched them eat with the focused, quiet pleasure of animals doing exactly what they were built to do. Dr. Patterson called in early October. He was writing something, a drought management case study for the Kansas State Extension Service, and he wanted to include her farm as a primary example. Could she provide her soil test records going back to 2014? The cover crop seed sourcing information? Details of the water infrastructure investment and timeline? She could. She spent an evening pulling together the records she had kept in a wire-bound notebook she bought at the Yates Center Farm and Fleet in 2014. Soil test receipts stapled to graph paper notes. Paddock rotation logs. Water tank installation receipts. Cover crop invoices with her handwritten notes in the margins, germination good, 70% strike, root depth excellent after 40 days. She mailed the copies in a large brown envelope. 3 weeks later, Dr. Patterson called again. The study had been seen by a researcher at Kansas State, and they were asking if Marlene would be willing to host a field day on her property the following spring, a demonstration of her soil health and rotational grazing practices for a group of extension agents and farmers from across the southeast quarter of the state. She said yes. She said it in the same quiet, factual voice she used for everything. After she hung up, she stood at the kitchen window for a moment. The letter from the extension office was still on the windowsill. She picked it up and read it one more time. Reduce flock numbers. Seek financial assistance. Consider emergency hay purchases. She set it down on the counter, not the windowsill. A small reclassification. The final numbers for the 2019 drought season came to her in pieces over October and November. Her operating costs from May through September had run about 12% over normal, higher water pumping costs from the secondary well, extra mineral supplementation, the targeted anthelmintic treatments for the 6 animals she'd flagged through FEMACHA scoring. She had not bought a single bale of hay. She had not hauled water. She had not sold a single animal into the drought market at depressed prices. Her flock had ended the season at 112 head. 0 losses. Not 0 losses because the drought had been kind. The drought had not been kind. The drought had been the worst in 83 years in Harlan County, and it had been hardest on the exact type of operation Marlene was running, a small producer, all-female flock management, limited acreage, no commodity crop income to buffer losses. Every variable that the county agent and the co-op man and the neighbors had cited as reasons she was particularly vulnerable had been real. The drought had been exactly as hard as everyone said it would be. She had built a farm that could hold water when the sky would not send it, and she had held. The field day came in early May of 2020. The previous week had been wet and warm, and her pastures were the deep active green of a farm in genuine recovery, not the pale struggling green of places still trying to come back from the summer before. 41 people came, county agents, farmers, 2 university researchers, a journalist from the Kansas Farmer magazine, and Brian Luer, who stood at the back of the group near the paddock gate and watched Marlene lead the tour with the expression of a man who was working something out in himself. She walked them through the rotational paddocks in the same order she walked them herself every morning. She showed them the soil samples she'd pulled that week, held up the dark, crumbled earth so they could see its color and its texture, the way it held together in a clump, the way it smelled, deep and alive, the way soil is supposed to smell but often does not. She showed them the sun hemp stands, still visible in the root crowns even after the winter. She talked about the FEMACHA scoring and the targeted treatment approach. She talked about the secondary well and the gravity tank system. She talked about all of it without drama, in the same measured, factual voice, because the facts were already dramatic enough. A young woman near the front of the group, a farmer from Chase County, maybe 30 years old, with the look of someone who had recently taken over a family operation and was still finding her bearings, raised her hand during the question period. "How did you know it would work?" she asked. "Before the drought came." "How did you know the soil building would hold?" Marlene thought about this. "I didn't know for certain," she said. "I knew the biology was correct. I knew the math held up. I knew I'd been in that soil every week for 6 years and I could see what was changing. But I also knew," she paused, and for the first time that morning she looked away from the group, out across the paddock, to where the Katahdins were grazing in the far corner, their warm backs moving slow and easy in the morning light. "I also knew that the people who were telling me to do something different hadn't ever dug down into my soil. They were looking at the surface. I was looking at what was underneath." The Kansas Farmer Journalist wrote that down. Dale Pruitt saw the magazine article in late May. It was 4 paragraphs, with a photograph of Marlene in the west paddock, the flock visible behind her, taken on the morning of the field day. The headline said, "Harlan County Farmer Reports Zero Losses in 2019 Drought Through Soil Health Management." 4 paragraphs that covered, in the compressed and selective language of agricultural journalism, 6 years of slow, invisible, solitary work. He came into the co-op the following week and bought her standard order, mineral blocks, sun hemp seed, a new float valve, and when she was at the counter, he said, "Saw the article." She waited. "Sounds like you had a good year," he said. Marlene looked at him for a moment. She thought about all the things she could say. All the Tuesday afternoons she had stood at this counter and received his patient, careful doubt. All the times she had driven home with her seed and her mineral blocks and her quiet, unanswered certainty. All the years of doing the thing that the knowledgeable people said was an overcomplicated way to do a simpler thing. "I had a hard year," she said. "That ended well." She picked up her bags and walked out. Carol Bremer came over in June, not with a casserole this time, but with a notebook and a pen. She sat at Marlene's kitchen table and asked to hear about the rotation system from the beginning. She was 62 years old and she'd been farming the adjoining land her whole adult life, and she sat and listened for 2 hours with the focused, humbled attention of someone who has recently revised a long-held opinion of herself. Travis was not with her. He had driven to Nebraska to look at hay. Carol had come alone. Marlene made coffee. She pulled out the graph paper and the pencil and she began at the beginning, not with the results, but with the soil. With what soil is made of and how it holds water and what it requires from the person farming it in order to do its full work. Carol wrote everything down. Marlene talked until the afternoon light came through the window and caught the dust on the windowsill, and she noticed, reaching over to refill Carol's coffee, that the letter from the extension office was still lying there on the sill, still there where she'd set it in April of 2019, more than a year ago, the paper a little yellowed at the edges, the official seal of the Harlan County Agricultural Extension Office still legible in the corner. She left it where it was. Some things you keep, not because they hurt you, but because they remind you of what you already knew. Her daughter Elena came out in August of that year. She stayed a week, which was the longest she had stayed since her grandmother Ruth died. She helped with morning checks, learned to read the FEMACHA scoring chart, sat with Marlene on the porch in the evenings watching the summer light go long and amber across the pastures. On the third evening, Elena said, "I think I understand now why Grandma said what she said." In the note. Marlene looked at her. "The land knows you," Elena said. "I used to think that was just something she said because she loved this place. But watching you out there," she paused, looking for the words, and she had her mother's way of not speaking until the words were right, "it's more like the land has been paying attention this whole time. Like you've been in a conversation with it." Marlene thought about this for a long moment. The pasture was settling into its evening sounds, The insects beginning their layered hum, the sheep moving in the near paddock, the soft percussion of the tank float valve cycling once, twice. The hedge apple trees in the north paddock threw long shadows eastward, longer now than when she'd planted them, which she supposed was the point. Conversation is the right word, she said. It's slow, though. You have to be willing to listen for years before it says anything back. Elena nodded. She was sitting with her knees pulled up on the old wooden porch chair, the same chair that had been there since their mother's time, one leg repaired with a bolt and washer that Marlene had put in herself. Elena looked like Ruth sometimes. Especially in the evening light. The breeding sale that fall ran in early October. Marlene had held back 14 ewes from the regular flock, her strongest animals, the best mothers, the ones with the longest FAMACHA records and the most consistent weaning weights. She had written up detailed production records for each animal, birth date, litter history, weaning weights, parasite resistance scores, body condition scores through the drought year of 2019. The kind of records that most small producers don't keep because they don't believe anyone will ask for them. People asked. She had inquiries from 8 buyers before the sale date. She had a buyer from southern Missouri, a woman from a small farm in the Ozarks who had read the Kansas Farmer article and driven to Harlan County specifically to see the flock. A young man from Coffee County who had been trying for 3 years to start a sustainable grazing operation. The retired schoolteacher from Eureka who had bought from her before and wanted to expand. 2 operations from Oklahoma, one from Nebraska, one from a farm in northwest Arkansas that Marlene had never heard of. The 14 ewes sold for a total of $12,460. She sat in the truck after the sale, in the parking lot of the Yates Center Livestock Market, with the check in her hand and the engine running and the October afternoon light coming through the dusty windshield, and she let herself feel it for a minute. Not triumph. She was not built for triumph. What she felt was something quieter and more complicated, the specific satisfaction of a long debt paid, except the debt was not financial and the creditor was not a person. It was something she'd owed to herself, maybe. Or to Ruth. Or to the land. The feeling that a thing done slowly and correctly and without applause had finally, in the plain language of dollars and living animals and soil that could hold water in the worst summer in 83 years, said what she had always believed it would say. She drove home. The farmhouse was warm in the early evening. She had started a pot of bean soup before she left that morning, and it had been sitting in the slow cooker all day, and when she opened the door the smell of it came out, beans and smoked ham hock and thyme from the kitchen garden. She stood in the doorway for a moment before she went in. On the kitchen windowsill, in the low October light, sat the letter from the Harlan County Agricultural Extension Office. Still there. Still yellowing. The return address still legible in the corner, the paper still holding its original fold lines. She set her keys on the counter. She hung up her jacket. She took the letter from the windowsill and held it in both hands and read it one more time, in full, the way she'd been reading it on and off for a year and a half. Reduce flock numbers. Seek financial assistance. Consider emergency hay purchases. 112 head. 0 losses. $12,460 from the fall breeding sale. 3.1% organic matter in soil that had started at 1.2. A secondary well. Gravity-fed tanks. Sun hemp and cowpeas in the resting paddocks. 45 to 90-day rest periods since 2014. 6 years of graph paper and pencil marks and soil samples and winter evenings alone at the kitchen table. She folded the letter back along its original fold lines. She opened the kitchen drawer, the one where she kept the seed catalogs and the soil test receipts and the graph paper and the pencil, the whole quiet archive of her working knowledge, and she placed the letter inside. She made a bowl of soup and sat at the table in the window light. Outside, the Katahdins were settling into their evening groupings in the near paddock, the ewes clustering near the water tank, a few of the older animals already lying down, their warm backs reflecting what was left of the October sun. Birch was among them, the pale splotching on her hindquarters visible from the kitchen window, her condition full and easy, indistinguishable now from any other healthy animal on a well-managed farm in A.